Welcome to Eldercare Illuminated, Torchlight's caregiving podcast. Eldercare Illuminated addresses the ins and outs and ups and downs of caring for your loved ones. Join us for interesting conversations with eldercare specialists, geriatric care managers, attorneys, and ordinary people with extraordinary caregiving experiences.
Welcome to Eldercare Illuminated, brought to you by Torchlight. I'm Lenore Tracy, Eldercare Practice Leader at Torchlight, which sponsors this broadcast. Today I'm joined by my colleague, Amy Lyman. Amy and I have a special bond as a couple of outspoken New Yorkers here in beautiful, more reserved, New England. And truth in advertising, I was born in New York, but I was really raised in New Jersey, so I probably don't really count as a New Yorker. We are both also daughters who have been faced with caring for someone they love with a dementia diagnosis. My mom died a couple of years ago after 9 years living with this terrible disease. And I have to say, I am grateful that my Alzheimer's caregiving days did not coincide with the coronavirus pandemic. It's a whole new layer of wonderfulness to add to the experience. Amy and her mom, on the other hand, are getting to do this now. And Amy has graciously agreed to share some of her caregiving story with us on Eldercare Illuminated. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you, Lenore. I'm so glad to be talking with you today. I appreciate you asking me to join you.
Amy, you've told me that your mom lives in a memory care facility. And you have had to deal with visiting and caring for her there during this whole COVID-19 experience. I think it will be really helpful for our listeners to understand what has that been like over the past few months. But before we get into that, would you start by telling us a little bit about your mom?
Sure, I would be glad to. You know, the interesting thing when people ask me about my mom is right away I struggle with tense because there are parts of her that are really relate to her former self. And there are things that have very much carried through and describe her today. So, you know, the reality is there really is kind of aspects of her that are her former self, which was an extremely capable person, extremely organized and successful. Really seemed like there was kind of no end to what she could juggle and manage. She was also an incredible cook. A very, I think her friends would say, kind of a glamorous hostess. She could serve a bowl of essentially boiled peas and it would feel like a delicacy and feel very elegant. She was also shyer and, let's say, kind of more appropriate than she is now. But there are many things about her that describe her now as well, then and now. So she is very much still, I would say, gracious and tries to help others. And she's very kind and quick with a compliment. So while she can be very repetitive, understandably, it's not a bad thing to hear a compliment over and over again. I totally get how lucky I am in this way because I know others with dementia can be irritable and, you know, unpleasant at times. And gosh, that must be so hard. So I'm grateful for my kind mom. She's had dementia for at least a decade now. So we're well into this journey.
Wow. And I thought that I had a long experience. That is quite the long haul. So in March, when this whole thing started, I'm talking about the coronavirus, were you still able to visit? Were you told that you couldn't visit or that you could? How did that all work?
Yeah, we were very much told no visits. So there were absolutely no visits that first first kind of couple months, I think. It felt like a long time. And, it's interesting, her facility, I have to say, they've been so excellent with their communications and their kind of efforts. It's amazing what they've done. But one of the things they set up very early on to facilitate communications was to set up a schedule to do kind of FaceTimes for the resident to FaceTime their family members, except that my mom did not understand FaceTime at all and found it kind of confusing. I imagine through her eyes, it must have felt like she was on TV or I was on TV. It just wasn't something she was receptive to. So we realized that regular old phone calls were a better way of keeping in touch those first few months. I remember assembling my 3 kids, and we were all kind of assembled and ready to connect with her on FaceTime, a scheduled meeting, and quickly realized after about a minute that she was not going to be open to that. So that's a memory I have from those kind of that early phase of COVID.
I think that you're very lucky that the facility that your mom is in took the time to do that. I have spoken with families who have someone in a nursing home or in an assisted living, and the nursing home just didn't have the capacity to pull that off. But it also reminds me, when you say that, of we're all on these Zoom meetings day in and day out. And sometimes the array of faces, it's just not helpful. With or without dementia, a plain old phone call, even a teleconference, might do the job better because we're not distracted by looking at the fancy backgrounds, or in my case, the frizzy hair. So you've worked that out.
I did read somewhere that, this business of seeing ourselves so much more than we're used to, it kind of lights up part of our brain that is usually quite quiet. So it's understandably kind of draining. And, you're absolutely right. I love a good phone call. I think that's a good substitute for sure.
So that it's good you figured that out with your mom. Have things changed since those very early, very scary days in terms of visiting?
They have, yes. So we are now, very much able to visit. There are lots of protocols in place, as you may imagine, including checking us in with a temperature check. It's entirely outside, so we don't go inside even for that checkpoint, and it's limited to how many people. So it's 2 visitors at the most in masks. And at a distance. So there's a lot that's changed. In addition, it has to be during business hours where, previously I would see her after work or on weekends, or there was a lot more flexibility there. So there's a lot of things that are different about visiting, but we are glad to be able to visit her.
That sounds stressful. And of course, I'm thinking winter is coming, so outside is really not going to be available. But I guess this is a time of change like we've never seen it.
I know. I had the same concern about the winter.
One of my sons was asking me, how are we going to do Thanksgiving? Like, don't you want to have turkey outdoors in November in Massachusetts? Sounds like a great picnic. When you do go visit your mom, does it seem like residents are able to understand what's happening and understand these procedures and requirements? I can't imagine that my mom would have tolerated wearing a mask, never mind being confined to her room or to any particular space. How's that gone?
You're absolutely right. In her particular, being a memory care unit, they do not wear masks, and it's that all of that stuff, all those protocols are not understood, certainly by my mom. But I will say, the interesting flip side of that is the only person in my life who is not longing for things how they used to be, or worried about the future, or kind of agonizing about this awful pandemic, is my mom. So I like to say that time with her is kind of a master class in living in the here and now. So you're absolutely right. She does not understand, any aspect of A, what's going on, or B, what to do. So in fact, the guests, so when I visit her, we wear the masks, but she actually does not.
I hadn't even thought about that. So she can be comfortable. She doesn't have this thing on her face, which is going to be bothering her. Has she asked you about it? Does she notice that you've got this?
Oh, yes. Over and over and over again. And I've learned at first we were explaining, why we were wearing the mask. And we've gotten shorter and shorter and shorter in our explanation about why we're wearing a mask. And now our response is, it's a rule. And that's all we say. And then we try to change the subject. It's many times over these 10 years, I've realized kind of short and sweet is okay, because they, are likely to ask again in 2 minutes anyway. So we just tell her that it's a rule that we wear them. So and we're getting better at kind of deflecting away from it and finding ways to kind of change the subject.
And that is totally the byword of people who are taking care of someone with a cognitive impairment, is to redirect.
Yes.
Change the subject, yes. Get a snack, go to a different room or a different bench outside.
Sing a show tune. We do lots of singing, so that becomes our way sometimes when in doubt to kind of change the subject, and that's a fun thing to do. So, but yes, that's something I've learned over the years for sure.
Music makes a huge difference in the lives of people with Alzheimer's. And we did a lot of singing with my mom as well. Are you able to interact with other residents? I know, singing, for example, when we would start singing and other people would join in and it would become a group activity, and I would have conversations with other residents. So that became part of visiting with my mom when she was in a memory care unit. Are you able to interact with other residents and sort of do anything as a group?
We're not, and I miss that so much too. That is a way to kind of engage, and it just makes it kind of an easier, more engaging visit. So we're not. We see her, outside on her own. And, we actually it was customary for me to bring her out to lunch, actually. So most visits with her, I would either dine there with her and sit with her and the other guests, or we would go out to lunch. Or we would sit and look at albums or magazines together in her room, that sort of thing. And that's all been so limited now. We're not able to kind of pass things back and forth, certainly not able to sit close enough together to look at something. So it is, to be frank, it's much harder, and the visits are much, much shorter, which I think the facility actually, they have been encouraging shorter visits anyway, just to kind of limit the, time and exposure that people have with each other. But I miss those elements of connecting with the other folks who are there. So much has changed.
I hadn't thought about that aspect of it, that you are physically separated. We talk about social distancing all the time. So I have in my brain, yes, of course, you're social distancing, but you are with someone who no doubt wants to sit right next to you, wants to hug you. Is it just you and your mom, or if you bring, one of your kids or somebody else along, or how is all of that negotiated?
I usually bring a rotating kid, or my husband will come. I have gone on my own. Last time we went, we brought our dog to see how that went. And we were allowed to do that. So we could bring our dog, and that became just an element of fun and an additional thing to kind of talk about and connect about. As I said, she's very focused on the kind of here and now. So that provided more in the way of conversation. We wanted to kick ourselves because we should have brought treats, because she could have maybe given the dog a treat, and that would have been a fun activity that we could do socially distanced. But next time, because it's very hard. Otherwise, you're kind of left with just the conversational piece. And of course, that's very hard for this, population. So we're learning as we go. I iterate a little bit each time.
Yeah. So books with big pictures or big, if you want to share stuff, it has to work at a distance.
Exactly.
Are aides or any other people with you?
Initially, the first couple visits or so, yes, there would be somebody sitting with her the whole time to make sure she didn't get up or just, I think to kind of see how it went. Now we are left to visit on our own. I think they kind of check in on us and things, but it's loosened up a little bit in that regard.
You've passed muster and they know that you will follow the rules.
Exactly.
When you do visit, I'm sort of imagining you finishing up a visit and going out to the parking lot to the car. Are you able to connect with other residents' families? A lot of places have a family council that meets regularly, or at least they used to. And that's a wonderful resource for information and support. And now more than ever, people need support.
Yeah, you bring up such an interesting area here. Being a kind of full-time working caregiver with still children of my own, I must confess that I have not been as involved or kind of plugged into that type of resource as I would deeply like to be. I'm also an only child, Lenore, so I have no one to kind of tag team with me. So my bandwidth is extremely narrow. It reminds me of the facility actually has support groups that meet regularly, and over, I think it's about 4.5 years she's been there. I've been only twice, and it was so helpful to me. I am not able to take more advantage of that type of thing given the kind of constraints on my side. But that's an interesting point about the family council.
Yeah, well, I found that was a helpful way to connect with other people who were going through the same thing. But of course, you'd be much more constrained now. But it sounds great that they have support groups, and maybe they're doing them over video conference now since people can't get together. I wish you had the time because it is a good thing to connect with other people who know exactly what you're going through. And the way you described yourself, you are very much what, we call in the business a sandwich generation caregiver. So you've got a young family and you've got your mom. How has this been for your children? And you said you bring them, I guess, one at a time. What's this been like for them, do you think?
Gosh, that's a good question. Well, I should say, I don't think I'd mentioned to this point. So my mom actually had COVID and was quite unwell. And that was, you can imagine, a worrisome time. That was in the beginning of the pandemic. And she wasn't quite to the point where she needed to be hospitalized, but almost. But I'm happy to say she's recovered back to her baseline. So when you ask about, my children and what their experience is, I have to say, I think for them to see who they call Tata, to be, back to their baseline. And here she is at 88 years old. And she did, recover from this very scary and serious virus. Plus, as I mentioned, she tends to be very kind of kind and complimentary. So I think it's been, very hopeful for my kids to know somebody firsthand who did manage to beat the virus. So that part has been very positive, oddly. Although, as I said, of course, it was scary when she wasn't well.
I think that's the first positive story that I have heard about an older person contracting COVID, but for kids. And so you're also negotiating this back to school thing. And you have a young child who will actually be able to support her peers in school by saying, well, my grandma had COVID and She's fine now.
We like to say, Lenore, that she was New York tough. You mentioned we're from New York. So yes, she likely will go in and share that with her classmates. And I think it's good to have a positive story here and there amongst the scary stories.
Yeah, because we hear a lot of scary stories these days, and especially when it comes to talking about the elderly and this diagnosis. Yes. I think about you bringing one of your kids into the nursing home and remember how the whole place lights up when you go into an assisted living or a nursing home with a child. The residents are smiling. They want to interact. They want to touch that youngster. So what you've described, it sounds like your kids are not getting to see other residents really because you're outside. And I think probably your response to bringing a dog in equally brightens up people's days. And so what a gift. I have this vision of you wandering around on the grounds like these small groups of a maximum of 3 people separated. They can't talk to each other. It sounds really difficult. What advice would you offer to people?
Gosh, well, first of all, just to recall my story about the not wanting to do the FaceTime, just again, a reminder to try to be kind of nimble and not fight things, we have to kind of go with a lot of the time. So that would be one thing, just switching up. If something's not working, that's just fine to kind of abandon and change our minds and change approach. Done that many times over. And then also, what I was saying about kind of simple, short answers. Instead of giving a long explanation about why we're wearing masks, just to say it's okay to say, that it's a rule. So those are couple things I've kind of landed on over lots of trial and error. Also always trying to, so normal and natural, I think, to have a lot of guilt along the way, about a decision about housing or how often you're able to visit or, many different things, and just trying to put that down. The younger version of my mom would certainly understand everything on my plate and what it is that I've done. So those are a couple thoughts, I'd say, in the advice column.
The whole guilt thing is really significant for caregivers today. And I think that's whether you're taking care of an older person or you have a child with special needs, or you're just getting through the day and you can't do all the things you want to do or as much as you want to do, or you don't do it as well as you chose to do. And there's just ample opportunity every step of the way to feel guilty about your performance. And, we're so performance oriented. It just doesn't help. I know that a lot of the materials that we put together at Torchlight try to emphasize and help people just let that go to the extent that it's possible, which is the tough one. I hate to be the person that sounds like, well, you need to take more walks and eat more vegetables and meditate every morning, which is all really good advice, but the day's too full and it's full of too many Zoom meetings possibly and too many people to take care of.
That's right. It's true. There's been a lot of that over this journey. And then, even the silliness of, as you're caring for one person, feeling guilty that you're not caring for another, those of us in the sandwich generation,
right.
You just never get it right because it's never enough on either end. So that's very hard. I have to say, I'm so grateful to work at a place that kind of acknowledges that caregiving, is an element of our lives. As I said, I'm only able to visit my mom now during working hours. So by definition, I have to kind of step out for a couple hours in the morning by the time I kind of drive there and visit and get back. So I'm certainly grateful for that, because then you layer in, the work responsibilities. It can be an awful lot.
And I, too, am grateful for that. And it makes a big difference if anyone out there is listening to this podcast and has the ability to make their workers' life a little bit better by being a little bit more flexible, a little more understanding. That's an enormous gift to give, because people who are taking care of an aging parent or a sick child or whatever the story may be, you're under a lot of pressure and you're not usually announcing and describing all of your caregiver woes because that would be just boring for starters. And who wants to declare all of your sorrows with your colleagues? But when you're in the middle of it, you're under. So yeah, managers, help out your working caregivers so
Yes.
they can fulfill all of their responsibilities a little bit more gracefully.
Yes, very true. Yeah. It's been a road. It'll be interesting to see what these next few months, 6 months, and on have in store. Probably a lot more change. I'll be curious to see how it unfolds.
Change is the only constant, as they say. So,
True.
Amy, that's about all the time that we have today. There is so much to talk about and so much for caregivers to pay attention to. Challenges of caring for a loved one, working remotely or in person. It's really hard to say which is more stressful. Taking care of young children and your own health. We don't talk about our own health a whole lot. All of this may seem insurmountable at times. So I wish you and your family all the best. And I hope that we can all take some comfort in sharing our stories and knowing that despite the bumps in the road, we'll manage. Thanks for joining us here.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, hang in there, everybody. You're definitely not alone. That much we know, right? We're in this together.
We are. I want to end today by sharing a quote from a 17th century English writer, John Bunyan. And although being a Puritan preacher probably means he was a rather difficult man and would have been appalled at the modern world, and we might have been or might be appalled at him, he is quoted as having said, "You have not lived today until you have done something for someone who can never repay you." And caregivers, that is the very nature of what you do every day. So thank you for joining us here on Eldercare Illuminated, and take care out there until we see you at the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Eldercare Illuminated, a Torchlight caregiving podcast. Find other episodes of Eldercare Illuminated on iTunes, Spreaker, and Podcast Go. If you're interested in bringing Torchlight Elder or any of Torchlight's other caregiving products to your workplace, please contact info@torchlight.care. That's info@torchlight.care.